Hey, how's it going everyone? I'm White Pointer and it's time for another video where I answer questions from you guys, the viewers, about how classic games pulled off their graphical tricks. This time around I'm going to be revisiting some games that I've previously covered in this series, as a number of you had some additional follow-up questions after I covered these games the first time. So let's put these under the microscope again to solve your long-standing mysteries. Let's get straight into it. The first game we'll revisit is Art of Fighting. You might remember we previously studied the Super Nintendo port of this game and how it did its scaling effect for both the backgrounds and the characters. Following that video, a few viewers, including Karanu and Sweeter Mio, commented that they wanted to know how the PC Engine version worked. So let's smash this version open to find out. So the PC Engine port of Art of Fighting was only released in Japan, and was therefore only referred to by its Japanese name of Ryuko no Ken. Not only that, but it was also exclusive to the Super CD-ROM add-on, and it required the arcade card that boosted the amount of available RAM. And no, I didn't just have brain fog. Despite the fact that the name of the add-on was written with a superscript 2 at the end, indicating that it should have been pronounced CD-ROM squared or something along those lines, it was officially called CD-ROM-ROM. I wish I was making that up. That aside, overall the PC Engine version of Art of Fighting is a pretty impressive port, putting the CD technology and extra RAM provided by the arcade card to good use, with large detailed characters that have smooth animations, an amazing soundtrack, full voice acting, and an authentic arcade experience. As you can see, it also does its best to replicate the zooming in and out of the arcade original, but unlike the Super Nintendo port, it's quite a bit more abrupt. It basically just instantly flicks between one size and another. This is because the hardware had no scaling capabilities. So how did the development team pull this one off? Well, you might have already guessed the basics of what's going on just from watching the footage you've seen so far, but there's a bit more to it than you might have realised, so let's break it down anyway. Clearly the game is cropping the image when it zooms in, but the way it's doing that is actually pretty interesting. You see, like other consoles at the time, like the Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo, the PC Engine could operate in several different resolutions. The most common one was 256 by 224, but theoretically it could be pushed up to 565 by 484. No commercial games got this high, however some homebrews have managed to hit 512 by 240. Why am I saying all this? Because this is how the game is flipping between the two different sizes. It's actually changing the resolution on the fly, from 256 by 224 when the characters are close together, to 304 by 224 when they are far enough apart. When in the higher resolution, the pixels effectively become smaller in order to fit on the TV, and if you look closely, you should notice that they are more squashed together when zoomed out, and everything looks a bit skinnier. There's also a bit of letterboxing with blank bars on either side of the image when zoomed out, which are removed when it zooms in. To try to make the transition a bit smoother, there's also a little bit of vertical background stretching with raster effects that is going on in between frames. The end result is still quite crude, I would say, and nowhere near as smooth as the Super Nintendo's effort, but it's still pretty impressive considering the hardware limitations. And at least they tried, which is more than what could be said about the Mega Drive port, which was actually the only conversion developed by SNK themselves. The developers behind this version, Alpha System, were responsible for a number of other impressive PC Engine ports, including Street Fighter, released as Fighting Street, the Yeast series, and Populous. The next game we'll look at again is Road Rash, but not the Mega Drive original. No, for this video we're tackling the Sega Master System for the first time. Following my video covering the Mega Drive version, quite a few viewers questioned how the port to the Master System was handled, given the very different hardware capabilities, including Shemon JPEG, Eleanor Burns 8686, Raphael Lima 83, and Flygon Breloom, and Flygon Breloom, and Flygon Breloom, and Flygon Breloom.
I heard you the first 100 times!
So let's check out how this was done. So here's the 8-bit version running, and despite how similar it looks, it's been done a completely different way to its big brother. For starters, the Master System only had one background layer, and while it did have a scanline counter, I believe it was actually the first console to have one built in as standard, it couldn't change the vertical scroll values mid-frame during H-blank like later consoles could do. It could only update them during V-blank. So with these restrictions in mind, just what kind of coding magic is happening here? There seems to be a lot of stuff happening, but it might not be entirely apparent what's going on, so let's take a look at the tiles. The road, including the sides of the road, the yellow lines and the grass are made up of background tiles that are animated, and this creates the sense of movement. It's quite fascinating to observe just how many tiles are constantly changing on the fly while the game is running. Looking at the tile map, we can see it's animated to become wider or thinner, and this is what creates the sense of undulating height. The Master System's scanline counter is then put to good use to horizontally scroll individual scan lines to create the bends in the road. To save on cartridge space, the game only stores the tiles for the right side of the road, and uses the Master System's ability to mirror background tiles to draw the left side. All tiles to the right of the yellow road lines are normal, while all tiles to the left are flipped horizontally. You can see the HUD at the bottom is also part of the tile map, and these remain static tiles that don't scroll or really animate at all. That covers the road, but what about the skyline? That looks like it's another tile map, or maybe a different part of the same tile map that the game is swapping to on a scanline that changes as the hills move up and down. Well, despite the fact it couldn't change the vertical scroll values mid-frame, it is still possible for the Master System to swap tile maps mid-frame using the scanline counter. There's 2 tile maps stored in memory in 2 different locations, one that contains the road that we've already looked at, and one that contains the distant mountains and sky. Due to how simplistic the road tile map is, there's enough room in VRAM for both. The console could swap the tile map mid-frame by changing the specific register that points to the name table address to a new value, and that's exactly what it's doing here. It wasn't a feature that was used very often, and when it was usually implemented as a static part of the screen like a HUD, but a few games pushed it a little further, and Road Rash was one of those. This top segment also has its own tile scrolling going on in order to make the clouds and mountains move at different speeds. Remember, this was all done on the base hardware, and it wasn't something its main competition, the Nintendo Entertainment System, could do without the help of mapper chips in the cartridge. The last piece of the puzzle is how the sprites are scaling, which are the player, opponents, and roadside objects like trees and road signs. This is using the old-fashioned fake scaling method of swapping in larger sizes of the sprites, but it's not preloading each size into memory like you usually see. Instead, it's loading in each size and swapping them dynamically when needed. The Master System did actually have the hardware function to double the size of sprites, but it's not in use here, as it actually affected all sprites on screen at once, so it wouldn't be very useful for this kind of game. It was bugged and didn't even work reliably on the original model anyway, nor the power base converter for that matter. The finished result is perhaps one of the most impressive ports from this generation of consoles. It's obviously cut back a bit, notably with far less sprites on the screen and less colours, but it impressively retains all the content from the 16-bit version. It even manages to run at the same frame rate of 12 frames a second. And all of the coding and graphics conversion was basically done by one guy too, Gary Priest, so hats off to him. A few videos ago, I covered some questions regarding Ranger X, or X-Ranza as it was called in Japan, regarding how it used line scroll in some clever ways to create 3D effects. Willow Epp had a follow-up question after that. They're curious about how they did the artillery going into the background city in Stage 1. Is it just sprites? A separate plane? Some clever updates to the existing plane? This will be a pretty quick one to solve, so let's fire it up and take a look. Here's the effect the commenter is asking about. Right from the start of the level, you can see there's shots being fired into the background to hit the city. What do you think is going on here? If you guessed sprites that are switching between different sizes, you're right. There's a few different sizes of these projectiles, and that clever arcing trajectory they are travelling in makes it more believable. A little additional exploding animation when they hit the end of their path to make it look like they collided with the city completes the effect. While we are on this first level though, I just want to draw attention to the really clever use of the priority system combined with more tile scrolling to make it look like there's way more than the maximum 2 tile map planes that the Mega Drive has. Just take a look at this, it's insane. You can observe how each part of each plane is set to either low or high priority to make them appear in front of or behind a part of the other plane, which are all scrolling at different rates to create an incredible looking parallax. And this is just the first level. They really came out with all guns blazing, so to speak. By the way, the team that made Ranger X was the same team behind Crusader of Senti, another game that we've previously examined, so they knew their stuff. But they flexed their programming muscles even more in this game, which these next questions are asking about. I'm not sure how to pronounce this user's name, so I'll just call them Caesar, and they ask if I can talk about the wireframe 3D parts in the game. Well, they say Star X here, but the comment came from the video where I covered Ranger X, and I assume they aren't talking about the Game Boy Advance game that carries that name. Danny Lockman1 also asks about these scenes. I briefly mentioned these when I talked about the wireframe effect in the game Surging Aura, but let's look at these a bit more closely. We know consoles like the Mega Drive were tile-based, so what programmers essentially needed to do for stuff like this, and the 3D models we saw in the last video, was to trick the console into thinking it's not tile-based and render a bitmap image instead. It's doing this by using background tiles with lots of different lines in various sizes and orientations and animating them as objects in the camera move. What's also interesting is that, similar to McDonald's Treasureland adventure that we studied last time, the developers left in a hidden debug mode for these 3D wireframe scenes, which allows you to freely move and rotate the camera around to see the objects from different angles. This proves that these wireframes are actually being drawn in real time, and it isn't some kind of pre-baked animation. If you have the game and are interested in trying this out for yourself, you'll need a 6-button controller, and in one of these 3D scenes you need to press B, X, Z and mode at the same time. This will activate the debug mode, then you can control the camera using the control shown on screen. Up next is the Lawnmower Man, both the Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo versions actually, since they both basically do the same effect. Logan Jorgensen and... sorry, I'm not going to try to pronounce that, so I'll just shorten it to Papel, both ask how the 3D-like virtual reality stages are achieved. I've been wanting to talk about this particular effect for a while, so let's put on our VR headsets and fill our brains with some knowledge. So both versions of the game have these levels that are played out in first person inside a virtual reality. They're basically auto-scrollers that require you to move left, right, up or down to avoid the walls as you move towards them. And some levels add combat to the mix by having you occasionally stop and shoot enemies. Clearly though, because we see the same effect on both consoles, Mode 7 isn't being used here on the Super Nintendo version, so we can rule that out. So how do you think this was done? Pause the video, make a comment with your guess, then resume to see if you were right. Firstly, even though these levels might look 3D, they actually aren't. There's no polygons happening here. All of these wall objects you see are flat 2D images, and are just shaded in a way that makes them look like they have depth. They are also all being rendered to background layers. The objects you see here are actually only a couple of tiles tall in the tile map, and as they get closer, they are animated to become wider. While this is happening, scanline interrupts are used to duplicate lines during H-blank to make the objects taller as well. It's essentially the same trick we previously saw this game doing, the Mega Drive version specifically, with the scaling head of the final boss, but in this case, both consoles are doing it. This is really effective and works really well because they are simple shapes. Even though the Mega Drive looks like it's running faster, they are both actually updating the image once every 2 frames, so both are running at 30 frames per second. It still seems the player travels faster on the Mega Drive, which probably makes these levels a bit harder than they should be. However, there is a difference in how they are working behind the scenes. The Super Nintendo version is actually running in mode 0, giving it a total of 4 background layers to work with, and it's used to make several layers of objects visible in the distance as you progress through these levels. I know a few regular viewers who'll be very pleased to discover another example of mode 0 being used. Yet the Mega Drive version still manages to look almost identical to this. But how? Any ideas? So far we've only looked at the Super Nintendo's tile maps closely, but if we examine the ones on Mega Drive, we can see they look a bit different. Each tile map on each of the 2 planes is split in half, and each half is also a bit taller than what we observed on the SNES. You can also see that the images are broken up into smaller chunks. The bottom half of each tile map is acting as kind of a frame buffer, updating 1 frame before the top half. When a new object appears, it's drawn to the background plane first, in a darker colour, making it seem like it's further away. As it gets closer, the palette changes, then it eventually moves over to the foreground plane. This gives it the effect of having more depth than it actually does, and is a pretty clever solution. They could have possibly achieved a similar result by playing around with the priority flags, but I guess they figured this solution was easier. When running at full speed, it's a cool effect, and I can't think of another game on either console that attempts to do something like this. It's worth talking about the Game Boy version here too, as it tries its best to replicate this effect as well as it can. There's no combat in any of these levels, it's just a straight run until you reach the exit. There isn't as many of them, and they are all pretty short. Clearly, the limitations of the hardware means that there isn't as many layers either, and it has a big black box underneath it, so it's only rendering to maybe 60% of the screen, probably to increase performance. Despite all that, if we examine the background layer in the debugger, we can see the basic principle behind the console versions still applies to this one. The objects are drawn to the tile map and animated to stretch out as you approach them, with scanline raster effects used to make them taller at the same time. They also change their shades as you get closer as well. Most of the time, all it's doing is drawing a wall with cutouts in it, but occasionally there's other objects too. The unique part of this version is those black vertical lines, which are actually sprite tiles. They are animated to make it look like they get larger by not only swapping in different sizes to make them wider, but also stretching them taller in a clever way. When they first appear, the sprite tiles are overlapping each other, but as they get closer, the tiles gradually push apart vertically to extend the height of the lines. The animation looks smooth and seamless at full speed, and it's pretty clever how they worked around the restrictions to approximate the experience from the console versions. If you're enjoying this content and would like to see more of it, make sure you subscribe so you know when I upload new videos. It's time to revisit Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie Kong's Double Trouble with this question from Mick to you. They noticed that the giant lurchin boss Bar Boss has a reasonably smooth and pleasant stretchy effect going on with its body, and is wondering how that works. Well, wonder no more. It's actually a bit unclear whether they are talking about the Super Nintendo original or the Game Boy game Donkey Kong Land 3, as Cape Codswallop is a location from the portable game and not the console game. So, why not do both? Let's dive in to discover what's going on here. We'll do the fight in Donkey Kong Country 3 first. As you can see as the fight plays out, Barboss's body stretches and contracts. How's he doing that? Any guesses? I'll give you a hint, Barboss's main body is a background layer. The game is using mode 1 here, so if you were thinking it was using offset per tile, that would be incorrect. The relevant background layer looks like this, and what the game is doing is using scanline raster effects to compress and stretch the middle part of his body. We've explored this a number of times during this series of videos, but it's been in the context of the Mega Drive, so it might be easy to forget that the Super Nintendo could absolutely easily do this too. Vertical scrolling is then used to move the top part of his shell up and down in sync with the stretching and contracting. The effect is completed by moving his eyes in and out. These are the only parts of his body that are sprites, aside from his mouth, and they simply animated to do that. So what about the Game Boy game, Donkey Kong Land 3? Well, here's the boss fight in question. It's actually the first boss you encounter in the game, unlike the SNES experience where it's one of the last ones. It plays out a fair bit differently too, and unfortunately you can only see half of his body, but let's see what's happening anyway. Now in the Super Nintendo game, as we just saw, Barboss is actually a background and his stretching effect is achieved using scanline raster effects. This is done a completely different way on the Game Boy though, as the GB only had one background layer, and that's already being used for, well, the background. So what's happening here? It's pretty simple really. Barboss is a sprite on this occasion, and his stretching and contracting is just a standard sprite animation. It's not particularly noteworthy on its own, but kind of interesting to compare how the method differed from more powerful hardware. Next on the list of games we're returning to is Contra 3, The Alien Wars. Last time we looked at how the first boss, Slave Beast Taka, worked, but on this visit, we're examining the second boss, the Bosco Spider, with this question from AL Axel. He says that the boss, which is also known by the name Metallican, rotates via mode 7 as a background image. However, the street the fight takes place on also seems to rotate independent of the boss, and the player character also seems to rotate when he does his spinning shot attack. So he wants to know how Konami were able to get 3 different assets to rotate all on screen at once. Let's attack aggressively to figure this out. Here's the boss fight the comment is asking about, one that is no doubt familiar to many of you. We can see the boss scaling as it makes its appearance and constantly rotating around during the fight, but we also see the road rotating as the player changes the direction they are facing, which can be in the opposite direction to the boss's rotation. There's some pretty clever trickery going on here from Konami, who are the masters of stuff like this. The boss itself is a Mode 7 background. There is a screen split to display Mode 1 in the top portion for the HUD, then from scanline 25 onwards the game is using Mode 7. But you probably already knew that. What you might not have realised though, is that grey colour making up the road isn't the background colour, it's actually part of the boss's Mode 7 tile map. But as you can see from how the boss drops in at the start of the fight, the player character is on top of the road but underneath the boss. That means, yep, it's using Mode 7 EXTBG. If you're unfamiliar with this special submode of Mode 7, I explain it in detail in this video, so check that out if you haven't seen it, and also to see examples of Mode 7 being used in lots of cool ways. In a nutshell though, it duplicated the Mode 7 tile map and allowed the duplicate to specify parts of it as a higher priority. With the boss set to a higher priority, it means the player character can move between it and the road, in the same way he can move under the bridge in the level leading up to this fight. Because it's part of the same tile map as the boss, the road is technically rotating too when the boss does, but as it's a solid colour, it doesn't actually look like it is. I'm actually not entirely sure why they went with this solution, because they could have simply set the backdrop colour in this bottom segment to grey, which would have removed the need to use EXTBG. Instead, the backdrop is set to black, which, yeah, is what's being used in the top segment, but each segment could have its own background colour. Maybe they knew some random Australian YouTuber would analyse this game over 3 decades later to try and throw him a curveball. So hang on, if the boss and the grey road colour are Mode 7, then what about the lines and cracks? Well, those are actually sprites. Each white line is made up of 2 rectangles, and each crack is a single sprite, both of which are animated to rotate when the player changes direction. Each sprite is only loaded once into VRAM, and you'll notice that every white line rotates identically and every crack rotates identically. The last thing the question mentioned was how the player character also rotates when he does his spinning attack. This is also just a sprite animation, there's no special tricks going on here. With all of the other advanced tools the Super Nintendo provided, it's sometimes easy to mistake simple animations like this as something else. To finish this video off, we are going back to Planet Zebus, as Furious Poultry says they've always wondered how they pulled off the Super Metroid Powerbomb effect. There's also been some other comments, like this one from Techno Estate, asking about the explosion effect seen in the intro. This will answer both of these, as it's the same effect. Let's make like the Mythbusters and blow things up for science. So here we are again, and we are specifically looking at this big explosion effect that happens when Samus drops a power bomb. It starts as a small oval shape that expands to gradually fill the whole screen, and the whole thing starts as a translucent yellow colour and eventually turns a whitish red. So how do you think the Super Nintendo is doing this? You might have already guessed just by looking at it, but this is a window with colour math supplied inside it. In this case, it's colour averaging. When one of the windows is active on the Super Nintendo, you specify the start and end position of it on every scanline. By specifying the correct values, you can make all kinds of shapes as the scanline moves down the screen, and if you make it just a little bit bigger each frame, you create this effect. By utilising the colour math circuit, you can specify the colour inside the window to be anything you want. If we use the debugger to slow it right down to the point where we can see the scanline moving down the screen, we can see how it's constructing the shape line by line for one frame, then making it slightly bigger on the next frame the same way. It might be a bit hard to see when the game is running at full speed, but there's actually 2 effects for a powerbomb explosion. An initial quick flash, then the longer expanding oval shape. The flash that happens first is also an expanding oval shape, but it's only for 6 frames, then the longer one happens. And yeah, as one of the comments implied, in case you were also wondering this, the Helio Bomb in Contra 3 is being done the same way. So that's another video where we've seen a large variety of techniques employed to achieve all kinds of results, pushing the hardware in ways that may not have been seen as initially possible. This video demonstrates that these games were often multifaceted too, utilising a number of different methods to create unique effects, and just when you think you know how one thing worked, you're left scratching your head about something else. Thanks so much for the questions, and thanks for your patience. I endeavoured to get to them all, but as you may appreciate, these videos take a lot of my personal time to put together. Keep leaving questions in the comments. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video, it really helps a lot, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my content. Thanks for watching and see you next time.